Before the world knew his name, before the heavens recorded his steps, before he became a whisper passed from generation to generation, Enoch was simply a man with breath, with bone, with doubts, with desires, with instincts that pulled him one way and a conscience that pulled him another. People often imagine him as a flawless saint from birth, but psychology teaches us that purity achieved without struggle is not purity at all. It is innocence, and innocence is merely the starting point, not the achievement. Enoch's life began like any other. He was born into a world still fresh with the memory of Eden, fresh enough that the echoes of the garden still lingered in the air, yet distant enough that those echoes were fading. The world was not yet drowning in corruption, but the seeds were already planted. Pride, envy, violence, self-centeredness, impatience. Small things at first. Harmless at first. But small things grow when no one pays attention. Enoch watched this unfolding. He grew up in a generation where men were stronger than their wisdom, louder than their conscience, and faster in action than in reflection. He saw the way people rushed to satisfy their impulses, and the way those impulses later changed them. He saw the slow decay of moral clarity, the normalization of small sins that would later blossom into great ones. He listened to his elders speak of Eden not as a memory but as a myth, a poetic story, a metaphor at best. But Enoch sensed something different. He sensed that Eden was not just a location lost on the earth. It was a state of being lost in the heart. The psychology of Enoch begins with the tension between what he saw externally and what he felt internally. Something in him refused to normalize what everyone else had normalized. Something in him whispered that life had more depth than survival, that purpose had more layers than food and shelter, that existence must have meant more than birth, reproduction, and burial. His mind was restless in a way others found strange. He questioned in a world that preferred comfort over curiosity. People around him saw the world as it was. Enoch saw the world as it could be, and that alone was enough to set him apart. But separation is not always pleasant. It comes with loneliness. Enoch's psychological formation included a deep loneliness, not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of insight. When you see differently, you stand differently. When you stand differently, you walk alone. His early years were marked by quiet observation, a subtle ache inside him that he couldn't name. He felt the pull of the earth, temptation, distraction, impulse. But he also felt the pull of heaven, conscience, wonder, yearning. The human mind is shaped by the forces it chooses to answer, and Enoch chose to answer the quiet voice rather than the loud one. That choice was not easy. Temptation does not lose power just because a man recognizes it. In fact, psychological resistance is hardest when the temptation aligns with one's unhealed wounds. Enoch struggled with the same weaknesses every human faces: impatience, irritation, self-doubt, the desire to be understood, the desire to be respected, the desire to not feel like an outsider in his own world. These desires were not sinful until they attempted to dictate his actions. Enoch's journey toward walking with God was not a sudden awakening. It was a slow chiseling of the soul. It began with noticing the shape of his own thoughts. He realized that the battle was not outside him, it was inside him. Sin was not an external monster chasing him. It was an internal whisper negotiating with him. He learned to pause before reacting, to question before agreeing, to examine before indulging. This made him appear strange to his peers, too quiet, too contemplative, too self-controlled. But that quietness was not weakness. It was discipline incubating. He began to practice what modern psychology calls metacognition, the ability to think about his thoughts. He observed why certain impulses rose in him, what triggered them, what they promised, and what they cost. He noticed how easy it was for a man to lie to himself, and how much courage it took to confront one's own motives honestly. He understood that the greatest danger in life is not being wrong. It is being wrong while believing you are right. That awareness produced something rare in him: humility. Not the performance of humility, not the scripted politeness people use to appear moral, but real humility, a deep understanding of his own frailty. That humility became the soil where wisdom could grow. And then something profound happened. Enoch's humility gave birth to honesty, and his honesty gave birth to intimacy, not with people, but with God. People often imagine that God chose Enoch for his closeness, but the truth is reversed. Enoch chose God long before God demonstrated his favor. Enoch's psychological transformation began with a decision that he would not live asleep. He would not drift into the moral fog of his generation. He would not be a man who reacts. He would be a man who reflects. He did not want to be controlled by impulses he never understood, nor driven by temptations he never confronted. In those quiet moments of reflection, something awakened inside him. a hunger for the one who designed the human psyche. He sensed a presence, faint at first, not a voice, not a vision, but a clarity, a stillness, a warmth, a guiding silence, the kind of silence that answers questions without words. This early awareness shaped his inner world. Enoch began talking to God with the raw honesty of a man talking to himself. No rituals, no polished speeches, just humanity reaching for divinity. This internal dialogue strengthened him. The more honest he became with God, the more honest he became with himself. And the more honest he became with himself, the clearer his mind grew. Psychologically, this was transformative. Honesty dismantles the ego. Reflection rewires impulses. Intimacy reshapes identity. Enoch did not overcome sin by force. He overcame it by understanding. He realized that sin grows strongest where a man refuses to examine himself. But when a man confronts his motivations, his urges lose their camouflage. And when urges lose their camouflage, they lose their power. This is how Enoch learned to walk with God. Not by being perfect, but by being introspective. Not by suppressing his humanity, but by surrendering his illusions. Over time, the presence he once sensed faintly became clearer, closer, more constant. This was not a mystical accident, it was psychological alignment. When a man consistently chooses truth over denial, conscience over impulse, humility over ego, and reflection over reaction, his mind becomes a home where God is not a visitor but a resident. This changed the way Enoch saw everything. He viewed people with compassion, because he understood the inner battles they didn't know how to articulate. He viewed temptation with respect, not arrogance, because he knew how easily the human mind could bend. He viewed life with gratitude, because he realized the fragility of breath. He viewed time with urgency, because he recognized its brevity. And he viewed himself with sobriety, because he understood how small he truly was in the presence of God. This transformation did not happen in a day. It unfolded across decades. With every choice, every reflection, every surrender, Enoch became lighter inside, less burdened by the internal chaos that torments most men. He reached a psychological clarity so rare that the boundary between the earthly and the divine began to blur, not in hallucination, but in alignment. People noticed something different about him, not because he preached loudly, but because he lived deeply. Not because he condemned others, but because he understood them. Not because he isolated himself, but because he chose purity, even when surrounded by compromise. His presence calmed people, not by charm, but by integrity. His family respected him, not because he demanded authority, but because his inner consistency made him trustworthy. And then came the season of fatherhood, a psychological turning point. The birth of his son, Methuselah, deepened him. Holding a newborn in his arms, Enoch saw the vulnerability of humanity in its purest form. He realized that his choices would ripple into generations he would never meet. This awareness intensified his walk with God. He no longer sought holiness for himself alone, but for the bloodline that would flow from him. Psychologically, fatherhood crystallized his purpose. A man becomes most dangerous to sin when he realizes that purity is not personal, it is generational. Enoch lived in a world slowly darkening, a world slipping inch by inch into moral decay, but he refused to surrender to the norm. He refused to dilute his conscience. He refused to silence the quiet voice. And with every refusal, with every choice, with every moment of alignment, he walked closer and closer into the clarity of God. Walking with God was not a mystical drift. It was psychological discipline. It was emotional maturity. It was spiritual attentiveness. It was choosing the higher impulse over the lower 1,000s of times across decades. It was building an inner world where God felt at home. And then something happened that humanity has never fully understood. Enoch did not die. Enoch died. Psychologically, this moment reveals something profound. Death symbolizes the final separation between body and spirit. But Enoch had spent his entire life reducing that separation. He had spent years closing the psychological, emotional, and spiritual distance between humanity and divinity. When the day came, the distance was gone. A man who had walked with God for so long that the line between earth and heaven had faded simply stepped from one into the other. His disappearance was not an escape. It was a fulfillment, a natural conclusion to an inner journey so complete that permanence in the physical world no longer made sense. Enoch teaches us something essential about the human psyche, that transformation is possible, that closeness with God is not mystical privilege but cultivated discipline, that purity is not perfection but alignment, that intimacy with the divine is not magic but daily surrender. He shows us that the greatest spiritual heights begin with the smallest internal choices. that holiness grows in the soil of self-awareness, and that the human mind is capable of a depth most people never explore because they fear the honesty required to enter it. Enoch's psychology reveals that walking with God is not an act of the feet, but an act of the mind. A state of clarity, a state of truthfulness, a state of inner resonance with the divine, a state where the soul remembers Eden long enough to live as if it never left. Enoch did not escape death. He transcended it, because a man who spends his life drawing closer to God eventually reaches a point where there is no distance left to cross.